Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 9 lecture. So as I've mentioned, we are covering a lot of ground this week because we spent some extra time on Edgar Huntley. So we are covering three different authors here in Week 9. We'll start with Washington Irving, and then we'll move to Nathaniel Hawthorne. We were supposed to cover those guys last week, so we'll start with them, and then we'll finish up this week with Edgar Allan Poe, who originally had all of Week 9 to himself. But I thought if I scaled back a little bit on the required readings for each of these authors, we could probably squeeze them all in 1 week. But of course, if you're still wrapping up next week, as I've said, that's okay. And also, if you're still finishing up Hope Leslie either this week or next week, that's okay, because just a reminder, next week, week 10, is a little bit lighter in terms of the reading load. So I'm going to try to go easy on you, just give you some short excerpts so you can maybe catch up on some previously assigned texts. So again, just reach out, let me know if you're having any issues, if you're still having trouble getting Hope Leslie, or any other schedule-related concerns. So we have a lot to do today, and we're sort of transitioning from Unit 2 into Unit 3. So there was a quote that I included on the syllabus for Unit 2. A lot of us might not have noticed it. It really wasn't broadcast anywhere in the modules, but it's a quote that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's kind of worth talking about, even though we are leaving Unit 2 behind today, and we're really starting on Unit 3, but I want us to talk more about what these units are really all about. So these last few weeks, really starting with our experiences with colonial literature, going back to Anne Bradstreet and the Puritans, we've really been discussing sort of the development, the growth of something that might be called a national literature. And I've sort of emphasized the fact that everything was very new during this period. Certainly, American independence was new. And a lot of Europeans claimed, a lot of, critics and writers overseas claimed that the U.S. really didn't have a very deep or rich history or culture or mythology of its own. So we've kind of seen how a lot of American writers from this, era of the early Republic sort of rebutted that, how they sort of responded to that in various ways, and they were all sort of trying to stake a claim in different ways, starting with Freneau and, to some extent Brackenridge, certainly Brown, certainly Sedgwick, what we were talking about with the, historical fiction or frontier romances last week. They were all sort of tapping into an older American history, a largely Native American history, or a history of frontier conflict between white settlers and Native Americans. But in many ways, they're all trying to show that we do sort of have a unique literature and culture all our own, and that belief would sort of accelerate in the decades to come. So if you go to the syllabus and you look at the start of Unit 2, which was back in Week 4 or Week 5, whatever it was, I have a little quote there from an English critic, sort of a literary critic, a clergyman, a writer named Sidney Smith, who's largely been forgotten today, but this quote that's often attributed to him lives on. So around 1820, Smith apparently wrote this in one of his reviews, sort of a disparaging remark about American literature, or the lack thereof. Again, we're not 100% sure if Smith even actually said this or wrote this. I think it might have been said by somebody else first, but it's often attributed to him. And the quote goes, it's a question that he's asking, kind of a rhetorical question. In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book? So he's being a bit glib here. He's trying to be funny. The point that he's making is that Americans don't produce great literature, and nobody is really looking to read literature or any sort of book produced in America by American writers. So, he's sort of joking, but there's a lot of truth to the sentiment, and that sort of encapsulates how a lot of European critics, writers, scholars, people who sort of paid attention to literature and public tastes. That's how a lot of them would have thought during that time. But what we're starting to notice here as we've moved through Unit 2, we started really with colonial period. We moved up to Charles Brockton Brown at the very beginning of independence. And as we mentioned, he was never that popular during his lifetime. We talked also about sentimental novels, and many of them were popular. The Coquette was pretty popular, even though it was published by Hannah Webster Foster anonymously, so she didn't necessarily get famous. But we mentioned another famous sentimental novel written by a writer who at least lived here for a long time, Charlotte Temple by Susanna Ralston. That became the first bestseller in America, the first best-selling novel in America, and it remained that for a long time until another sentimental novel knocked it off, Uncle Tom's Cabin, shortly before the Civil War. So we know there are popular works being produced in America, but it takes several decades for us to really build up a reputation and sort of a repertoire that's extensive enough to be called distinctly or uniquely American. So a lot of this is tied to genre. We've talked about how the Gothic romance and then the frontier romance, these genres that really originated in the British Isles overseas, we see how they've been adapted to American subject matter, American geography, American characters. So already that trend has been happening, and we notice that as we move into this this sort of next generation, after, post Brown, post the colonial writers, we've moved into Sedgwick and talked about some of her contemporaries like James Fenimore Cooper. They become pretty popular over the course of the 1820s and 1830s, due largely to these frontier romances that they're writing. But I've mentioned another writer of that similar generation who becomes popular around that same time, and he becomes quite popular. And that's Washington Irving. So that's who we're starting with here in week 9. So Irving would perhaps be our first response or our first rebuttal to Sidney Smith when he asks his sort of, sarcastic question, who in the four quarters of the globe would ever read an American book? Well, one of the first American writers to really be exported, if you know what I mean, like one of the first to really be read outside of the U.S. consistently was Washington Irving. So I've mentioned him the last couple of weeks, but we are finally reading him today or this week, and you can learn a little bit about his bio if you want to check out the week 9 overview. Like I said, he's a little bit older than Sedgwick and Cooper, but he's often lumped in with them because they're all sort of ascending at roughly the same time. Again, Irving's career kind of takes off a little bit sooner, like in the late 18 teens. Whereas Cooper and Sedgwick start publishing some of their popular novels in the 1820s. But we're in the same neighborhood. And Irving's interesting. He sometimes gets kind of squeezed out, and we don't read him as much anymore. In large part, he was a very prolific, interesting, accomplished writer. But one of the reasons he doesn't always have as much of an outsized presence in lit classes is, well, one, he didn't really write novels at all. And two, he wasn't primarily a fiction writer throughout his career. Early on, he wrote fiction, but mostly he wrote short stories and other kinds of miscellaneous writing. If you ever look into his catalog, you'll notice that he does a lot of travel writing. He writes histories. He writes sort of like nonfiction, quasi-journalistic essays. He wrote biographies. He was a real sort of all-purpose man of letters, a little bit like Brown, who we mentioned was maybe America's first true professional writer, in that he really made his whole career out of writing and editing. Irving sort of follows in those footsteps, though he also served as an ambassador. That was part of why he sort of did well overseas. He lived much of his adult life outside of the U.S. He lived in England, believe he lived in Spain for a while. So he was pretty well traveled, in part because of his sort of diplomatic service. But also his writing became popular, starting with something that he wrote kind of in installments I think around between like 1819, 1820, the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. And if you take a look at that, again, it's sort of a mismatch of different kinds of text. A lot of what he called sketches would be probably called short stories today. These were just sort of brief scenarios, brief fictional narratives that were often sort of comic, kind of slight, but, well made and often, very sort of entertaining or amusing. So he was definitely writing fiction, and he's often thought of as one of our early practitioners of the short story. Another literary form, much like the novel, that's pretty popular today, but we should remind ourselves that it hasn't really been around that long. And like the novel, American writers were kind of important in the popularization of the form. It's often argued that kind of, proto versions of short stories probably existed in Europe, before American independence, but it's really not until the early 19th century that the sort of modern conception of the short story is born. And by that point, we have American writers working. So Irving, Hawthorne, and Poe, who comes a little later, they're all sort of early practitioners of sort of the modern short story. We've always had short prose narratives, so it can be a little hard to delineate the history of the short stories in particular, because I've mentioned those old sort of chivalric romances. Those were often sort of shorter prose narratives, maybe not quite the length of a modern novel. So kind of always had prose fiction like that going all the way back to antiquity, but again, sort of our modern sense of the short story really sort of picks up in the early 1800s, not that much later than novels. So Irving's kind of important in that regard. What we are reading this week is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and I would call that sort of a long short story. Some might call it a novelette, or maybe even a novella. I don't think it's quite long enough to be those. We would probably just think of it as a long short story, or maybe somewhere between a short story and a novella. And that's about as long as his fiction got. But like I said, he wrote a lot of nonfiction as well. And he had a very long writing career. In many ways, his writing career kind of overlaps with a lot of with much of this younger generation that we're going to start talking about today as the American Renaissance. That includes Hawthorne, Poe, Melville. They're all younger than Irving, and they all got started a little bit later than him, but he lived a long time and he kept writing. So in some ways, his career kind of overlaps with theirs, but he stopped writing fiction. Later in life, Irving largely focused on histories and biographies. He wrote some criticism, some essays, but really didn't write much more fiction later in his career. So largely the stories, the fictional stories that he's best remembered for, largely come from the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. And if you look at that collection, you'll really see some key characteristics of Irving and some of the reasons why he's still pretty popular amongst some, and some people still think he's kind of fun. He has a very playful narrative style. And if you'll notice, Geoffrey Crayon, the narrator of many of his fictional sketches in that book, is sort of this narrative persona that he creates, and Crayon's sort of this like well-heeled gentleman, but Irving really loves narrative frames, and he loves to make them rather complex. So the sort of central conceit or framing device in a lot of his short fiction in the sketchbook, and even in some of his later collections as well, like Bracebridge Hall, like the whole idea is that Crayon is the narrator, so he's telling us these stories, but many of the stories were found by Crayon, so he like discovers this like treasure trove of old written text, mostly recorded by this old Dutchman named Diedrich Knickerbocker. So the idea is Crayon's found Knickerbocker's old papers, and now he's relating a bunch of the stories that he found in those papers. So as you can kind of imagine with that setup, there's a lot of playfulness, there's a lot of sort of at times unreliable narration, because we're getting the stories at like a second or third hand remove. So that gives Irving a lot of opportunities to play around with sort of the nature of storytelling, like how stories get passed down, how they get remembered, how certain things might get distorted. And another thing he likes to do, and we see it in Sleepy Hollow, which was originally a part of the sketchbook, that's where it was first published, we get another one of Irving's preoccupation, which is old Dutch New York. So I mentioned Knickerbocker is this character like who's supposed to be this old Dutchman from like sort of the distant New York colonial past, and Crayon is using all this stuff that he finds in Knickerbocker's papers. And of course, readers aren't really supposed to think of Knickerbocker as being a real person, but he does sort of represent an older Dutch history of New York City that you guys might know a little bit about if you know much about New York, or if you've ever been there. You might know that the Dutch were actually the first Europeans to colonize that area. Of course, the Native Americans were already there, but the Dutch got there in the pretty early 1600s, and they established colonial rule for several decades before the English came in and essentially wrestled control of Manhattan and some of the surrounding areas from the Dutch. But a lot of Dutch settlers, or the descendants of the original Dutch settlers, remained. And even to this day, if you go to that area, not just New York City, but like further up the Hudson, sort of what we might think of as just like upstate New York, even as far as like Albany, a lot of stuff still has Dutch names, like streets or particular geographical locations, and even some old families that have been there for a long time. They might still have, preserve some of their Dutch heritage, or they at least still have Dutch names, Dutch last names. So that's an old colonial history that's very specific to that region. The Dutch really weren't in big numbers in any other part of the U.S. I mean, there were other Dutch settlers, but it's really in New York where there was the biggest concentration and the oldest history, that particular history. So that's another thing that we're noticing with a lot of the texts that we've been reading. We saw it with Sedgwick last week, not just history, but very regional specific history, right? So think about Sedgwick using the history of New England, particularly the future states of Massachusetts and maybe, the surrounding areas like Connecticut. But that's a very particular region with a very particular history, largely comprised of Puritans, the Pequot War, other conflict with local Native Americans. And she's documenting a lot of that. And like we saw last week, she's using a lot of that as the backdrop for her fictional narrative. Brown is doing a similar thing, probably in a less focused way, but again, he's regional specific. He's very interested in the regional history of colonial Pennsylvania, particularly eastern Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia, and the settlement of that area, the Delaware Native Americans, what happened with them. So that's a regional history as well. And we get another one with the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now we're in New York, along the Hudson River. We get all these place names, Tarrytown, the Tappan Zee, right? These are all very much designed to create a specific sense of place, an idea that we are going back to kind of an earlier era of American history. Remember, Irving is writing this in the early 1800s, but he's hearkening back to an earlier time. The story is set in a slightly earlier time, perhaps, but it feels even older. That's something the narrator wants us to understand. It feels like we're kind of going back in time because this sort of old Dutch community has not changed much since the 1600s. It's largely retained its sort of unique character, and it isn't modernizing as rapidly as the rest of the U.S. And Irving and his narrator very much want us to notice that and think about that. So again, Irving got pretty famous, got largely popular on the strength of the sketchbook, and then Bracebridge Hall, which is sort of a similar collection of kind of all sorts of different writings, but a lot of fictional sketches or short stories. That comes out a few years later. And again, he's read in England. He becomes kind of popular in England. He also lives there for a while. And he becomes the first American author that people overseas are sort of talking about, reading, and excited about. So a lot of scholars and critics think that he kind of lays the groundwork for this next generation of American writers that come to be known as the American Renaissance. So we're going to get into them a little bit in a moment, but that really starts with Hawthorne, and then we'll move into Poe. And really all of Unit 3 is devoted to the American Renaissance. And I just want to be clear, that's kind of an outdated term that I'm using because it's still sometimes used to describe a group of writers in a particular time period that starts like roughly maybe at the end of the 1830s and extends almost up to the start of the Civil War. Kind of this blossoming, this flourishing of American literature, and a lot of the writers who have often thought to be responsible for it have sort of been lionized and thought of as these Renaissance figures who helped to really put American literature on the map. That was the narrative for a long time. We can push back on it a little bit. It's still believed by many, but a lot of others question it, and we're already seeing that, Irving, Sedgwick, Brown, Cooper, who we're not reading, but another important writer of frontier romances, they're all creating a lot of these templates and genre adaptations that are going to be very pivotal for the American Renaissance figures. They're already sort of laying the groundwork, but it is true that this next group attains a little bit more fame. But again, a lot of that fame comes later, and a lot of it actually is attributed to a process that happens roughly 100 years later when the American literary canon really gets sort of established and codified around the time of World War II. So we'll talk a little bit about that so we can understand the Renaissance as a sort of conceptual category, a grouping that maybe has outlived its usefulness, and we're also expanding the American literary canon now and trying to include more sort of representative voices so it's not such an exclusive club anymore. So we'll get into some of that because there is some politics associated with the Renaissance, the way it was historically thought of and the way it's being thought of now and sort of reconsidered, reimagined now. But I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on Sleepy Hollow before we move into Hawthorne and really get the Renaissance underway. This is a narrative that most of us are probably familiar with. That's why I picked it. There's some other good pieces from the sketchbook. I also included Dolph Heiliger, which was from Bracebridge Hall, the next collection he did in the early 1820s. Similar in that we have multiple frames, playful, but very much steeped in an old Dutch history. That one's optional. I don't expect many of you to have time to read it. It's a bit lengthy, but it is lots of fun if you enjoy Sleepy Hollow. But we've all probably seen some rendition, some version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow at some point. There's an animated film version. There was the Johnny Depp, Tim Burton film adaptation from the early 2000s that some of us have seen. I mean, it pops up in cartoons, lots of different forms of media. I would argue it's one of these texts, and we're going to see actually a lot more of these in the weeks to come. It's one of these texts that has become a part of American pop culture even to this day. It's pretty impressive. It's, roughly 200 years old, and it's still around even if a lot of us have not read the original. Right? Even if a lot of us haven't read the original version from Irving, we've probably experienced the narrative somewhere else. Maybe as kids, again, maybe in sort of a cartoon, animated version. It's in lots of different media. So that's an interesting phenomenon. We're going to notice it a lot with Poe as well. How certain texts or just certain ideas about Poe really live on in our pop culture, and they become almost separate from Poe himself. So we might know a little bit about The Raven even if we've never read that poem. It's just kind of permeated our pop culture a little bit. We might even know some things about Poe even if we haven't read them or we're not that familiar with his work. So this is an interesting sort of cultural phenomenon that we will observe more and more as we get into more famous, well-known texts. And this might be one of the first ones that we're familiar with before the class ever begins, right? A lot of the stuff we've been reading before now probably new to us. But the Legend of Sleepy Hollow should feel somewhat familiar. It's sort of stayed with us, and we've retold the story many times. And if you've consumed it in kind of a comic fashion, you're actually staying pretty true to the original vision. A lot of Irving's short fiction is comic. This one is no exception. I mean, it has some genuine scares. It has some genuine sort of frightening moments, but I would say the predominant mood is sort of lightly comic, lighthearted, fun. There are some thrills, some scares, but if you're reading carefully and you sort of follow the explanations that are embedded within the text, you'll realize that a lot of the fear, a lot of the scary stuff kind of gets diffused by the end. Not for Ichabod. I mean, he's legitimately frightened, but of course we're meant to laugh a little bit at Ichabod. We're meant to find him to be a somewhat ridiculous character, and we kind of understand or get to the bottom of these mysterious apparitions, these things that appear to be pursuing him and terrorizing him. There actually is sort of a rational, logical explanation for all of it, but Ichabod doesn't necessarily know the rational explanation, and it's important to note that a lot of the local townspeople don't know either. So there's this idea that superstition lives on, particularly in sort of rural, isolated communities where things don't modernize as fast. There's this idea that, it's a legend, it's sort of mythic. It's not necessarily rooted in fact, but people believe it. People stay more sort of in touch with their old folk ways, their old sort of pre-modern ways, and that's a place where superstition, legends can really thrive. So that's part of it. There's also some social commentary here that you have to sort of look for to be aware of, but I wanted to clue you guys in just a little bit because Irving's making some interesting commentary about the growth of the young country. And as modern readers, it's easy for us to kind of overlook that, or to just, not notice it, to not really have it register for us. Because we have to realize, right, we're in the, the late 18 teens. The U.S. has only been independent for roughly 30 years or so, and we're already starting to expand. There's new states. There's new territorial expansion, acquisition. We're pushing further west, and of course that will only continue throughout the rest of the 19th century. And this isn't a history class, so we're not going to go through all of that, but it's just good to keep it in the back of your mind and to remember that not all Americans were necessarily in agreement when it came to expansion. Not everybody necessarily wanted to expand. And there were real questions, real concerns about what would happen if we continued to push west into areas that were largely coded or understood as Native American sort of land, or areas where many Native Americans still lived. So there was this understanding that, conflict would necessarily ensue. And there would be, some struggle. And some people thought it was worth it to continue doing that, to continue pushing west and creating new cities, new settlements for Anglo-Americans, for the descendants of Europeans. And then there were others who thought we should stay more or less how we were geographically and not continue to expand. And many thought the best way to ensure peace with Native American groups was to sort of stop expanding, to stop pushing west. One kind of interesting thing just to consider is that during our colonial history, there was actually a sort of royal edict passed down from the king that said we weren't allowed to push beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So again, if you guys think back to history class in school, if you're thinking of those 13, original colonies, we're hugging the Atlantic coast, right? We're on the seaboard. If you look at all those states, they're all along the East Coast. So for a long time, pre-revolution, there wasn't a ton of settlement, even just west of the Appalachian Mountains, which kind of run all the way through the southeast, up, really to Maine, I think. So just take a look at a map to kind of sense how we were relatively confined to that eastern seaboard during colonial times, and then settlement got opened up after independence. But again, that wasn't universally regarded as a good thing. Not everybody necessarily wanted to keep pushing west, and the reason the British passed that rule is they thought it would keep the peace with at least many Native Americans if colonists simply weren't allowed to settle west of that mountain chain. But we stopped even before the war. I mean, a lot of settlers ignored that rule and would cross and would go over. And conflict with Native Americans would often ensue, but it was often sanctioned, by leaders here, and certainly after independence, it was often sanctioned by the federal government, but don't feel like it was approved and done by the federal government in some cases, but don't feel like it was a unanimous thing. It was a really vigorous sort of ongoing public debate about expansion. And we talked last week about sort of this quote-unquote Indian problem, as they would have called it back then. What were they going to do? How were they going to assimilate these Native American populations that they were often displacing through expansion? So there were a lot of questions and debates surrounding these issues. So we can see some of these works of literature as taking part in some of these larger debates. Hopefully we can see how Hope Leslie was participating in that debate that we were discussing last week. But one thing Irving wants to point out is that everything is changing very rapidly in young America. And that's what makes this community, this particular corner of Dutch New York, unique. Because in these little nooks of still water, things have not changed as much. Those old traditional ways are still in effect. The area is still largely Dutch, still kind of retained that original Dutch character. And he contrasts that with rapidly modernizing America. Where things are constantly changing and people are constantly on the move. So one thing to keep in mind about Ichabod, our worthy pedagogue. So remember, he's like a traveling or itinerant schoolmaster. So he's not a local. He is not a native of this part of New York. He is not of Dutch ancestry. He's a Yankee. He's from, I think they say Connecticut, like maybe somewhere in New England. So he's not a local. He has come here to work. But there's a sense that he is going to be moving on soon. So Crane, in a lot of ways, represents the larger nation. If you notice some of the ways that Irving describes Crane, characterizes him, again, we're meant to kind of laugh at him. His physical appearance, in some ways, is meant to be funny. His reaction to the scary stuff that's happening to him is often meant to be funny. But also, notice some of the other descriptors that Irving uses. He makes it clear, like he calls Crane a great feeder, like he really likes to eat. He eats a lot. That sort of, it's funny, but it's also kind of important. It's symbolic. He's very acquisitive. He's a great consumer of things. He's also after money. He is after money. Katrina obviously has a lot of, appeal for him on different levels, but he's attracted to her, but also her family is wealthy. So he's attracted to the family money, and over the course of the story, we learn that he has these dreams of taking part, really, in U.S. expansion. We hear about some of these new states that had recently been created, like Kentucky and Tennessee, and he kind of dreams of, with Katrina's family money, going to some of these new frontier regions and making a fortune, making a new life, buying land. and flourishing. That's what he wants to do ultimately, and that's very representative of what a lot of Americans were doing during that time period. Leaving their eastern seaboard homes and going out west, or again, west back then would have been, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, going to places like that where land was often cheap and available for white people, and where they could go and potentially, start a new business, start a successful farm, do whatever presented itself. So a chance of kind of remaking yourself, self-making. We talked a little bit about this going all the way back to Cabeza de Vaca, this idea that you can go to a new place, this really important principle in a lot of American history and sort of our own mythology, this idea that you can go to a new place and you can sort of become a new person. Doesn't really matter where you're from, doesn't matter what you were doing before, you can start fresh. That's a big part of what would later become sort of thought of or known as the American dream, that sort of idea of people coming here pursuing opportunities that maybe they could not have pursued before. But that's also operative within the country, right? People leaving their original homes, going to a new home on the frontier where they're hoping to make sort of a new life. So again, there's a contrast here. Ichabod's all about acquisition, movement, going to the new place, doing some new things, right? That's what he's all about. And he's supposed to stand in stark contrast to this old Dutch community that is kind of stuck in the past, but in sort of a charming, maybe aesthetically pleasing way. And they're not so acquisitive. They're not so focused on expansion, moving outward and upward. It's more about tradition, continuity, and sort of maintaining a coherent culture and cultural identity. So Irving's expressing a little bit of a fear and an anxiety that I would argue a lot of literary-minded people, critics, people that were pretty well off and well educated, they worried that one obstacle to America creating a unique literary culture was the fact that we moved around so much, that we were so focused on commerce and, clearing the frontier, again, to use the sort of terminology that they would have used. And it was often thought that, we don't have enough time. We're not sitting down and actually creating great works of literature because we're too busy buying this or buying that, moving here, starting a new business, doing whatever. And some of that spirit, I think, is still thought of as being kind of, true to the American character. But Irving is using Crane as kind of a stand-in for these larger national traits or habits. And I was hoping I could find this. I think it's at the very end of the text that I posted. Let's see. I don't know if I'll be able to locate it because I'm a little all over the place here. But if you look at the very end of Sleepy Hollow, the very last page, he talks about some of the things that Crane goes on to do later. So we learn that he does leave Sleepy Hollow and goes on to do other things. Here we go. Yeah, so this is on page 32. And this is easily lost on the modern reader, but this series of occupations that Crane would later keep is, again, sort of supposed to be characteristic of this restless, almost rootless nature of Americans. And these are also some jobs that are kind of, in some ways, quintessentially American. So he moved away and he does a bunch of different things. He kept school. He studied law at the same time. Okay. He had been admitted to the bar, so he becomes a practicing lawyer, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court, which is sort of like small claims court, or sort of the equivalent of that. So just what that is supposed to kind of illustrate is that he did a bunch of stuff. He moved around. He's sort of the quintessential American. He was a journalist. He was a lawyer. He was a schoolmaster. He was a politician. He was a judge. He was sort of rootless. He always wanted more, never quite content with where he was. And again, these are kind of foundational ideas that go along with the American character, but some older school gentlemen like an Irving or a Cooper, who sort of styled themselves a bit more on like a sort of older English gentleman model, sort of found the constant pursuit of commerce and money to be perhaps a little bit objectionable. And again, they wondered if we ever could have a really vibrant sort of culture when we were always moving around and looking to make a quick buck. But I would argue they got their answer soon enough. We were able to create a literature despite all of that. So that's enough for Irving. Just enjoy the story, but do pay attention to how the narration works, how the humor works, and how some of the supposedly supernatural stuff ultimately does get explained. Okay, so let's move on to Hawthorne, and we'll spend the rest of part 1 of this lecture on Hawthorne. So I do have to break up the week 9 lecture into a part 1 and a part 2. So we'll do Irving and Hawthorne here in part 1, and then we'll do Poe in part 2. So Hawthorne is another New Englander. He was born on the 4th of July in 1804, and like Sedgwick, he descended from a long line of Puritans who had been in the region for a long time. In fact, you might know this about Hawthorne, but one of his forefathers, like a great-grandfather, I don't know how many greats, was actually a judge in the Salem witch trials. And there's a legend about Hawthorne. I don't necessarily know that it's true, but he does change the spelling of his name, or maybe it was his father who did that. I can't quite remember, but a lot of historians argue that perhaps he did that, or his father did that, to distance themselves from that sort of ugly chapter in their own family history. But Hawthorne is often thought of as one of the great American writers of the 19th century. Irving might have become our first real literary celebrity, but like I said, he doesn't get read as much and hasn't been anthologized quite as much because he's not a part of this American Renaissance generation. And that's really where we are entering now. So Hawthorne, along with Poe and probably Melville, Whitman, and Emerson, were often held up as the preeminent 19th century American writers, the most important, the most skilled, and the reason they were all kind of lumped together and considered part of this American Renaissance is that they were all roughly contemporaries of one another. They were all writing around the same time. Again, sort of beginning with Hawthorne and Poe and a little bit of Emerson in the 1830s and moving all the way up through sort of the end of the 1850s. Well, not all of them. I mean, Poe was dead by then. But those who still lived were writing pretty much almost up to the start of the Civil War. So this was long considered a really important historical period in the development of American literature, and it's often thought that Hawthorne kind of helped to kick it off with some of the short stories that he published in the 1830s. But what is worth remembering about Hawthorne is that particularly early in his career, he was not meeting much success, right? So between 1825 and 1837, we're pretty sure that he was producing some of his best short fiction, and he was publishing some of it, but he did not meet with very much commercial success. Just simply not many people were noticing his works or really talking about them. That began to change a little bit in 1837 with the collection Twice Told Tales. It got some critical acclaim when it came out, but it really wasn't for another 10 years or so until 1846 when he published another short story collection, Mosses from an Old Manse, that he really started to get some attention. He started to get some critical attention, critical praise. And in Mosses from an Old Manse, we actually had some earlier short stories that were republished and finally did get noticed, like Roger Malvin's Burial and Young Goodman Brown, a couple of our optional short stories for this week. So he gets a little bit more attention later, and then he writes some well-known novels. You might have been forced to read The Scarlet Letter in high school, also The House of the Seven Gables, The Marble Fawn. So he was a novelist and a short story writer, also a critic, wrote essays and a few other things as well, but was never really that famous or all that commercially successful during his lifetime. But later, posthumously, he was, I wouldn't say so much rediscovered. I mean, he never completely went away, but he was championed by a generation of American literature scholars in the early to mid 20th century, really. Like I said, roughly 100 years after this stuff was published and came out, he was sort of positioned as one of these titans of American literature who wasn't necessarily appreciated during his time. And that's a pretty similar role to what we'll see Melville filling, and kind of to a lesser extent, Whitman. None of those guys were massively popular during their lifetimes. We've mentioned that there was popular literature getting produced during this time, but it wasn't coming from these guys. It wasn't coming necessarily from the future Renaissance figures. It was largely coming from those sentimental novels that we've already been talking about. So Hawthorne has a famous quote that you might read about if you ever look into him or read his Wikipedia page. I might not get it quite right, but he's writing a letter to a friend, and he curses the damned mob of scribbling women, I think is how he puts it. So he's really referring to a lot of the authors of popular sentimental novels. He doesn't really mention many of them by name, but that's who he's referring to with that disparaging comment. So, like I said, a lot of these sentimental authors were women, and they were later excluded from the American Renaissance and the larger American literary canon that got created, like I said, around World War II, shortly before World War II. So writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Maria Cummins, Fanny Fern, Eden Southworth, they were producing popular novels throughout these sort of middle decades of the 19th century, but we're just now sort of returning to that stuff, reading it, anthologizing it, and putting it alongside the traditional Renaissance figures. So it's just important to keep a little bit of that history in mind as we move through Hawthorne and these other traditional Renaissance figures, and then we'll complicate this group a little bit next week when we read some more examples of the stuff that actually was popular in the middle of the 19th century. But a big reason why Hawthorne, Melville, Poe, Whitman, they all came to be lionized and championed later was because scholars really thought that their work epitomized a lot of the most important ideas, contradictions, sort of philosophical orientations that were all native to America, that were all unique to the U.S., our history, our people, our culture. So again, the decision to put these guys at the top, it wasn't based on popularity during their lifetimes. It was based on this idea that they were doing the most important work. They were doing the work that best represented sort of what was going on in America, or ideas and controversies important in America. But even that, we can expand that and include some more text as well. But typically, with the Renaissance, we would start with Hawthorne because he was writing as early as the 1820s and 1830s. So Hawthorne is kind of best remembered today for documenting life in New England, sometimes going back to the Puritan past, like in The Scarlet Letter, to do that. That's very much a work of historical fiction. But I would say the best way to appreciate Hawthorne, I mean, his novels are famous, but all we're going to do is check out one of his best-known short stories, and that's probably the best entryway into Hawthorne for modern readers. His short fiction remains pretty accessible, and appropriately enough, since we have other spooky stuff this week, we're going to look at least a mildly spooky tale. And then I've also included Roger Malvin's Burial and Young Goodman Brown, which are both a little bit spooky as well. So Hawthorne's kind of getting us in that right Halloween mood. And My Kinsman Major Molyneux is probably one of his best works of short fiction, and it's just very representative of his style and some of his big preoccupations, some of the motifs or ideas that he's mostly that he's most interested in. So this is a pretty short text, a short story. It's a recognizable short story in terms of its shape and form. So again, that's one of the ways we do remember Hawthorne along with Poe. You'll notice that Irving's short stories might not seem quite as modern, but Poe and Hawthorne are helping to really codify what U.S. readers will understand as short stories. They're helping to kind of define that young, fledgling literary form. So that's very much what we see here. It's a very elegant, well-constructed short story, no wasted space. It's also got a lot of humor in it. I know it's sometimes hard as modern readers to appreciate some of the humor in Hawthorne, but there's a lot of irony, but also there's a lot of ambiguity in the story, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and there's kind of two levels for that. If we're thinking about illumination, the idea of being able to see clearly, Hawthorne's playing around with that idea quite a bit in the text. So on the one hand, the entire story takes place at night. And we're in the 18th century, so there's no electricity. It's very dark. We only have torches, and the moonlight to guide our way. So on a very literal level, it's dark and it's hard to see. But then there's a sort of more figurative way of understanding illumination, and that has more to do with understanding. And our protagonist, Robin, is struggling to understand certain things about life in the city. And he's struggling to understand certain things about his uncle, his kinsman, who is not quite as popular in this urban environment as Robin may have expected him to be. So slowly, over the course of the narrative, Robin begins to understand. He begins to see the light, and then literally things get illuminated for him near the end, both in terms of how he understands his uncle and his uncle's relationship with the people, and also how Robin is beginning to understand himself and his own role in this larger society. So it's highly figurative. There's a lot of irony. There's a lot of symbolism running through the text that is kind of easy to miss on your first reading. So I would encourage you guys, if you have the time, maybe try to read this story twice. The second reading is very rewarding. I can still remember reading it for the first time in college as an undergrad in a class very similar to this, and I didn't get it the first time. I mean, I was paying attention, I was trying my best, but I did not understand much of what happened until I went back and read it a second time after our professor encouraged us to do that. So I would encourage you guys to do the same. So in many ways, Robin is sort of a classic hero or protagonist that we might expect to find in a Bildungsroman, if you guys know that type of novel. Also very popular in the 18th century in England. Better known now as just like a coming-of-age story. We often start with a young person, kind of naive, they don't really understand how the world works, and much of the narrative revolves around them learning how the world works and getting into and out of scrapes. Even some sentimental novels kind of functioned along those lines. just oftentimes with a heroine, with a female protagonist, but much of the same kind of subject matter would occur. They find love, they find disillusionment, they learn how cruel the world is, they try to find their way. These were popular stories, and Robin is the type of character that we would expect to find in that kind of story. He's naive, he's young, but he kind of means well. It seems like he's sort of endearing. One critic refers to him as ludicrously wrong-headed. Yeah, he's wrong about a lot of stuff, but we have to understand why, and we might see that it's not all necessarily his fault. A lot of it is circumstantial. So Robin comes from a rural New England community, and he is visiting the big city to see his uncle, who's like some kind of, as we come to find, he's like sort of a colonial administrator, or he's kind of involved in the local colonial government, which is maybe not the best line of work to be in during this time period. And it's most likely that we're in Boston here. I don't believe we ever get a place name in particular, but most critics, just based on kind of the details and just the time period, there weren't a lot of particularly big cities in colonial America. Boston was one, and that's probably where he is if it's a New England city. So he's probably leaving his rural home for one of the first times, probably the first time that he's ever been this far away, and he's going to the city by himself. So this is obviously kind of a rite of passage. This is a very important moment for him as he kind of leaves childhood to a certain extent and enters adulthood. But much of what fuels the narrative is that Robin doesn't understand what's going on in Boston. And I would argue that readers might not immediately understand what's going on either, because Hawthorne's narrator isn't always in a huge hurry to explain things to us. So it might help to have a little bit of historical context. So again, if we're in Boston here, again, a lot of people place it somewhere maybe like in the 1730s. So again, we're going back to this older colonial period. But a lot of what's happening, a lot of the sort of agitation that's taking place in the city was sort of based on the Stamp Act crisis, which actually happened several decades later in the 1760s. And this kind of secret society that we notice in the text, they're based on a real sort of underground society of anti-British sort of revolutionaries known as the Sons of Liberty. So again, this is kind of historical fiction. Hawthorne is drawing upon some real colonial history of the region. Now, he's fictionalizing a lot, and he's changing the time period a little bit. Again, the Sons of Liberty and the Stamp Act crisis, that happened later, just about a decade before, the revolution. So that was all the stuff that was really leading up to the war, as colonists got more and more, angry and frustrated with, their overlords, their masters back in England. So Hawthorne's tapping into that history, and what Robin doesn't get is there's a lot of unrest in the city. A lot of the inhabitants of the city have had it with their colonial sort of rulers. So again, these were rulers or like governors or mayors sort of in the modern sense that were put in place by the British Crown. Right, the Americans, the American colonists really didn't have any say in their local leadership, and as we know, we also didn't really feel like we had any representation. We were being taxed, but not represented. So there was a lot of unrest, a lot of sort of subversive acts. A lot of people were doing things to kind of undermine the British Crown, undermine the representatives of the Crown, serving leadership roles in cities here like Boston. So that's happening, and that's happening in the city. And Robin doesn't really get it at first. He doesn't really understand that there's kind of a political movement underway, and there's these subversive acts. These people are defying the local government that's there to rule them. So that's happening, okay, and it takes a while for him to see the light. So a lot of the narrative really takes, sort of consists of his misunderstandings. Him failing to understand his surroundings, the people, the customs. So there's comedy that comes from that, but also we're meant to notice the contrast between, his sort of rural, backward, crystallized in time kind of rural home versus this rapidly modernizing city where there's a lot of political unrest, there's organizing, people are up in arms and pretty much on the verge of an open revolt against the British. So, and there's a couple of things that the narrator does to kind of exoticize Robin in kind of a weird way, to almost make it seem like he's kind of an alien or a foreigner in this city. So, at one point we hear a reference to Robin's native woods. This idea that he's from the woods, right? He's sort of uncultured, he's untutored, he's sort of a country bumpkin. And at another point, the narrator mentions a wizard who lived in Robin's country. Again, Robin's country, almost like, or his country, almost as if it's a separate country. It exists separately from this more sort of modern, urban environment of Boston. So we're meant to think of Robin as kind of being an outsider. He doesn't really understand the customs, the political scene, what's going on in the city. So again, a recurring motif here is misunderstanding. He is seeking his kinsman, but he also assumes that because his kinsman's kind of an important person and has sort of a leadership role, he assumes that the wheels have kind of been greased for him a little bit. Like, he tries to throw his uncle's name around. He mentions who his relative is because he thinks that's going to open doors for him. He thinks that his uncle, being, a respected authority figure, once people hear that name, they'll say, oh, okay, well, we'll bring you to him, or we'll tell you where he is, or we'll be accommodating to you, we'll give you a meal, whatever. And he realizes, of course, that's not the case. People aren't terribly friendly to him, or in other cases, people might try to take advantage of him, take advantage of his lack of understanding. So, again, there's some comic misunderstandings. He gets lost. He also kind of grows increasingly frustrated. There's one moment where it seems like he's ready to use his oak cudgel, and just keep in mind, again, Robin is somewhat innocent, at least in the way that he's initially portrayed, but just keep in mind, he's from the country, he's coming to the city, and he carries with him an oak cudgel, which is like a big club that he's obviously brought for the purposes of self-defense in case he's in any kind of danger in the city. And we never see him use it, but he at least considers using it at one point. So that's another thing that we kind of get a whiff of. I mean, there's a lot of kind of brewing violence in the city. Again, there's unrest, people are angry. We later see that there's been some tarring and feathering, which was a real practice that people engaged in, and there was actually a long tradition of it in the colonies. Revolting American colonists would sometimes tar and feather their colonial governors as a sort of show of protest, or just sort of a way to express their dissatisfaction with the British Crown in general. So there's kind of this brewing sense of violence and unrest and instability, but Robin isn't completely above that or separate from that. We get a glimpse at times that, out in the country, they might settle some of their problems through violence as well, a little bit like what we saw from Huntley, or even at times in Hope Leslie, because certainly these frontier districts were not havens of peace and tranquility, as we've already noticed. Perhaps Robin is somewhat familiar with the long history of frontier conflict with Native Americans. If he had not experienced it himself, it's likely that his father, older siblings, uncles, other relatives probably had. So he's not exactly a stranger to violence. He's just a stranger to the city and this kind of urban way of living and some of the new political and cultural developments that are underway that maybe he hasn't caught wind of yet back in his more rural community. So anyway, just try to pay attention to what's going on. And as Robin fails to understand, see if you are able to understand. And there might be some useful footnotes as well that you should check out. By the end of the text, Robin understands the deal with his uncle. He understands that his uncle is not a popular figure and that it's actually not going to behoove him to have any association with his uncle. So again, pay attention to that passage. I believe in our PDF, it's on page 13, because he's illuminated. Finally, his knowledge is finally, the light finally shines on the truth. So he gains the knowledge that he did not possess earlier in the story. There, the torches blazed the brightest, and the moon shone out like day. And there, in tar and feather dignity, sat his kinsman, Major Molyneux. So again, pay attention to the lights. There's a lot of sort of figurative stuff going on with the lights. The light of the moon, the light from the torches, and this larger idea of illumination and what Robin can and cannot see. But by the end of the story, he kind of has it figured out. He understands what's going on with his uncle, and he seems to begin to understand his own role and his own maybe somewhat precarious situation. It seems a little bit precarious at first. But then he has that very telling conversation with this guy that he kind of meets in the crowd. And this guy is helping him to understand what's going on, some of the larger movements afoot in the city. So there is some disillusionment as Robin kind of comes to lose some of that innocence, but he also comes to learn some important things, and we get a sense of that from his conversation with this other guy, this other guy in town that had gathered for this procession, through the streets. And Robin wants to get home. He asked the guy how to catch the ferry to get back to, wherever he came from, his rural home. But notice that his new friend encourages him to stay. And he says, "Oh, perhaps you would remain with us, as you are a shrewd youth. You may rise in the world without the help of your kinsman." So a lot of critics point to this as a very important passage. And also notice the repetition of the word shrewd. It's often used to refer to Robin. Originally, it's ironic because Robin really isn't shrewd. He's naive. He's kind of ignorant and gullible. But by the end, when this character says it, it's at least more true. But notice what the character is saying. He's saying, you should stay here. Stay in the city among us. And because you're a smart, intrepid young guy, you can rise in the world without the help of your kinsman. So a lot of people say this is another contrast. This is a juxtaposition between sort of a new world meritocracy where it doesn't really matter who your family is. You can go to a new place, start new, a little bit like what Ichabod wants to do, and just make a new life for yourself. And it doesn't really matter who your connections are. And that's a contrast to kind of a more old world, European, traditional way of doing things. And we might notice that. I mean, that is the reason Robin's in town. He's trying to kind of get ahead in the world. And because his uncle is a somewhat important person, the idea is he'll be able to trade on his uncle's name and get a job or get some kind of an opportunity based on that family relation. That's very much how things would have worked in the kind of early modern or medieval world back in Europe. But what a lot of critics claim that what the neighbor is saying here to Robin is this is a new world, right? This is a new way of doing things, a new society. doesn't really matter where you come from or what your name is. It's more about freedom. It's more about maybe American values, and it's more about this idea of self-making or remaking. And even though we don't necessarily know if Robin stays, at least that idea has been implanted in him. And he better understands that maybe that is something he could do. All right, so that's enough for part one, and we'll wrap up with Hawthorne. But again, if you enjoy the story and you want some more spooky stuff, at least check out Young Goodman Brown, which is one of our optional readings. It's in the Week 9 module. So now we'll leave these two behind, and we'll cover Poe in part 2.